What up? I got Naskin here with me. This ain't a diss song, but yeah, you know what it is. I'm a cheesehead, y'all niggas cheese whiz. Pittsburgh Steelers, that's nothing. That Super Bowl ring, that's nothing. Pull up in your town when you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Packers Unscripted from Packers.com. I am Mike Spofford, joined by my trusted colleague, Wes Hodkiewicz. We're coming to you here from our studios at Lambeau Field. And, Wes, the Packers have begun their preparations for the big NFC showdown coming up Sunday Night Football in San Francisco, or Santa Clara, I guess, is where the game's going to be played, but against the San Francisco 49ers. And Matt LaFleur, Packers were back on the practice field for a brief workout on Monday as everybody came back from the break over the bye. Matt LaFleur spoke to reporters, spoke to the media after practice, and he wasn't going to get into a lot of specifics as to what did the self-scout reveal, like what did you guys find out, how are you going to go about fixing things. Of course, he's not going to share all the nitty-gritty details, but he did talk a little bit about each of the three phases of the game for the Packers. I don't think there's any major revelations here, but the Packers, the bottom line is the Packers know what they have to work on heading into this home stretch of the final 6 regular season games.
They do, and I mean, the nice thing for them is they finally have some time to sit back and rest. A lot was made of the fact that they aren't that banged up going into the bye.
Yeah.
And that's true from a perspective of guys not actually, missing practice time, but they were still. So to get some bodies a little bit healthier, get that, week and a half of rest and recuperation going into the San Francisco game, this is where I look for Green Bay to put their best foot forward on Sunday. And, even more so, talking to Kenny Clark and some of these guys in the locker room these last 2 weeks and when we've had availability, they understand where they fit in the grand scheme of things. The defense knows. Tramon Williams talked about it again on Monday. They have work to do. They are by far, not a finished product yet at this point in the season. They feel like their best ball is still ahead of them. Offensively, you've seen intervals of dominance and you've seen intervals of lulls. They're trying to smooth that out, and special teams certainly, has made some changes even going into the bye. But where I stand on this right now is that, all these years, Mike, you go back, and these are the prime years of Mike McCarthy's tenure too, the way the Packers have come out of the bye in a lot of seasons has really been an indication of where this team is going to go in the long run. I think there's a stat somewhere around maybe 7-3 over the last 10 years coming out of the bye week. They need to make those adjustments. There's going to be some unscouted looks, I'm sure of it, on Sunday against San Francisco. And they need to find, some of those galvanizing moments that really make a good team championship caliber.
Yeah, well, when you look at things on the offensive side of the ball, I think the thing that that continues to stick in the craw of Matt LaFleur, I guess, if I'm allowed to use that phrase, is
absolutely
is the penalties. I saw a stat this morning, actually. I unfortunately didn't have it for the story that I posted on the website last night, but I believe the Packers have a total of 25 either false start or delay of game penalties through the first 10 games of the season. Now, those are only 5-yard penalties, but those 5-yard penalties, that changes 2nd and 3 to 2nd and 8, and gets you in those behind the chains types of situations. And to be averaging 2.5 false start or delay of game penalties on offense through the first 10 games of the season, you can see the opportunity there to become much more efficient offensively, to put yourself in better third down situations if you can just – you're not going to eliminate them completely. They're part of the game. But if you can reduce those, because 2.5 per game through 10 weeks, that's a lot.
Yeah, in the delay games, that's always a little bit of an altered stat, too, because there's 2 instances in the last couple games where the Packers have actually taken them to give J.K. Scott a little extra room.
True enough.
But that being said,
yes,
the specific instances that Aaron Rodgers talks about that he needs to be better in, and Matt LaFleur has discussed in trying to get those calls in. They've had some communication helmet issues, and that's been prevalent, I think, throughout the league, trying to deal with some of those things at times. But the one I go back to is the false starts, because that's the one I felt like going back to Lambeau Field, they would smooth some of those things out. It's a tough environment to be in Los Angeles, and I know it was a very pro-heavy Packers crowd, but there were still a lot of Chargers fans too, making their voice heard, and that's difficult to work through those changes. But you got to be able to shore that up at home. It's unacceptable to have those at home.
Yeah.
You need to be able to find answers there. And that was a big point of emphasis, and I'm sure as they went through some of the self-scouting and trying to find ways to maximize their offensive opportunities, that's something they go back to. There was a play against Carolina, and I don't know the exact measurables of it, but I believe it was something along the lines where they had, I want to say, a 9-yard run by Aaron Jones, and there was a false start. That takes it from being 2nd and 1 back to 2nd and 6.
2nd and 6.
Or 3rd and 1 back to 3rd and 6. The percentage change every yard you go back is huge in this league. And credit to Green Bay, one of the reasons they are 8-2 is they've worked through some of those things. You had the Devontae Adams 34-yard catch on 2nd and 26 or whatever it was. You can find ways with your playmakers to do that, but you can't live that way, and they need to find those answers.
Yeah, I mean, right now offensively, the Packers are converting. I believe they're at 37.2% on 3rd down. It's in the bottom half of the league. It's below the midway point. That's not a horrible number. 37% is not horrible, but you'd like to be, once you're in the 40s on your 3rd down conversions, you're in a pretty good spot. I mean, what Matt LaFleur found out as he looked at all the numbers, and this is sort of self-fulfilling. I mean, it's kind of obvious that 3rd down and 7 or less versus 3rd down and 8 or more, but he found a really large discrepancy there. I think maybe a larger discrepancy than you would normally find.
Right.
Because I believe the number is when it's been 3rd and 7 or less or 3rd and 6 or less, one or the other, the Packers are actually above 50%.
Yeah.
That's pretty darn good. But the problem, and the reason they're at 37% overall on their 3rd downs, is because they've had way too many of the 3rd and 15s and the 3rd and 12s and the really, really tough spots, which have been a result of either those false start penalties or a holding penalty or a sack on 1st or 2nd down that really puts you behind the chains. Those are the things that, Matt LaFleur, yes, there are going to be some unscouted looks. They're going to do some new things, I think, against San Francisco, and as we move forward here into December that maybe we haven't seen yet. But Matt LaFleur's goal offensively is just to improve the efficiency. And it's not about drawing up a whole bunch of new X's and O's stuff. It's like, What do you do to sharpen things up and become more efficient down the stretch? And that's what they're focused on.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because when you go back into those 3rd and 8 pluses or 3rd and 12s, that's where you see the Packers having to empty it out a little bit more. And credit to Aaron Rodgers, they have found ways to be successful in those intervals, but there's so much more predictability to that.
Yeah.
When you have those type of looks, you know more what you're getting. When this offense is at its best, and we've seen it, especially on some of these first series of games this season, it's when they can be multiple, when they can go with bunch formations, when they're able to shift their personnel on any given play, on any given possession. That's where they're going to make their money, and that's where this offense is. Ultimately, if they get on a deep run here into the playoffs, that's where they have to be successful. As great as it is to put the ball in Aaron Rodgers' hands, and he's one of the best in the league when it comes to being able to dictate those situations, you see the Aaron Joneses, you have the Devontae Adams. You need to win those early down situations to make them their most dangerous, and that's when this offense is at its peak.
Yeah, well, on the defensive side of the ball, we've been talking about it for several weeks. So have the Packers, so has defensive coordinator Mike Pettin. It really has been the explosive plays allowed that's really hurt this defense. I'm not an X's and O's expert. I don't know exactly how you go about fixing this thing. Matt LaFleur has made comments about communication a little bit in terms of not only getting the right defensive personnel in the field, but then all the pre-snap stuff, making sure everybody has the call, maybe not trying to change the call at the last minute quite so often, which is how certain guys can get out of position. I also think there's maybe a little bit of a balance that Mike Pettin is trying to find in terms of the aggressiveness to go for the ball, because the turnovers are such a big part of the game and have been such a big part of what this defense has done, but not at the expense of, risking giving up those 20 and 25-yard pass plays that have really hurt this defense. So I'm just curious your thoughts on kind of where things stand with this defense now, and and what needs to be done to cut down on some of those explosive gains.
Yeah, it's something that I think is probably the biggest thing that had to be a point of emphasis in the self-scouting process.
Right.
Easy for me to say.
Yeah.
That's the one, too, where there's so many different things that stitch together that not only can result in being able to play cohesive, lockdown defense, or having those breakdowns, that it's always difficult to pinpoint one specific thing.
Yeah.
Because I get it from Mike Pettin's perspective. You got a lot of ball-hawking players in the secondary. They have a really productive pass-rushing combo up front in one of the league's best young nose tackles in Kenny Clark in the middle. So for all intents and purposes, this should be a dynamic and impactful defensive unit. But there's been too many of those situations where guys come free for not even just the 75-yard touchdown type pass. I'm talking about the 30, 40-yard passes in the middle of the field, 50 yards here and there. That is the chunk plays that it's difficult to come back from. Fortunately, Green Bay might have one of the top run, red zone defenses in the league right now, that they've been able to survive that. But if offenses start to chip away at you there and you don't find answers, that's when you start to see the dam break. So,
yeah, it's a tough way to live, for sure.
That's where it's tough to put a finger on it. And this was the most unique thing. I was thinking about this last week, and I looked it up just now. Packers are right around that 13th, 14th ranked spot right now for scoring defense, points allowed. Which, at the end of the day, you can make an argument that's the most important one of all. But a lot of times it's not always the same, but it sometimes equates to where you rank in total yards. In this case, it does it. The Packers are 28th right now in total yards per game. The defense is above them in scoring points per game. New England at 1, San Francisco at 2, Buffalo is 3. They're leading both categories. Then it's 8, 15, 14, 18, 4, 7, 5, 10, 6, 12. That's where teams rank in total yards. And then you have Green Bay with 28.
At 28,
It's such a strange anomaly. And that's why I brought it up on the show before. I get kind of punchy when people talk about this being like the 12 or 11 defense. I still don't see it like that because while there were breakdowns, teams were also scoring quite a bit too. A lot of shootouts the Packers had to win that season. This hasn't been that case. So it's in this in-between, but unless you get it corrected the last 6 weeks of the season, your record, your stats are what you say you are in some regard, and that's why the Packers have to get it cleaned up.
Yeah, I mean, there have certainly been offenses that have put up the 400-plus yards. The defense that we saw from the Packers in September. Now, granted, that was a Bears offense that's been struggling all year, a Broncos offense that's been struggling all year. So some of that was the result of the opponents. But you can also just, you go by the eye test. The defense doesn't look the same as it did earlier. And, those big plays, they kind of started in week 2 against Minnesota. Then they came back in week 5 against Dallas when Dallas was way behind, and they started taking these big chunks of the field. And then it's kind of been a problem since then. It's not something that they've been able to curb. Now, looking at the stats against Carolina, they only allowed, I believe it was only 3 plays in that game of 20-plus yards.
Right.
But there were a whole bunch of pass completions that were in that 15 to 19-yard range that Carolina still racked up 400 yards by the end of the game. Yes, the defense obviously made the big stand at the end, and at the end of the day, Carolina only had 16 points on the board. So you take that anytime you can. But the Packers know they're in this. You call it kind of the middle ground. It's kind of a precarious place to be because of the yards that you've surrendered. Because you get up against teams that are more efficient in the red zone and are going to punch things in more often for touchdowns, and then suddenly that points allowed number starts to climb.
And this is where we're going to learn a lot about this defense here in the last couple of weeks because, you mentioned Dallas. Dallas is leading the league right now in total yards of offense. Kansas City is 3. I don't want to hear about Matt Moore. They still have explosive playmakers there that can make life difficult. Detroit is 8. Minnesota is 9. Oakland, for as much as been made about their situation, they're 11th right now in total offense. So they've played good offenses, productive offenses.
Yes.
This week is going to be a huge test. San Francisco is as dynamic and as versatile and multiple as teams get. But after that, you got the New York Giants, you have Washington, you have Chicago. You need to lock down in those games. The thing I liked about that Carolina game was that, Carolina puts up 400 total yards of offense. The Packers won that game, though, because of their defense.
Yeah.
Sometimes the yards aren't what matter most, and it sometimes comes down to the points. But when you look at those games beyond this week, I don't care what the total yards are. I don't care what the points are. If the Packers win the game, they accomplish the goal. But going up against New York and Washington and Chicago, you expect them to be able to get on a run there in December because of where those offenses have ranked this season and some of the issues that they've worked through.
Yeah. All right. Well, before I forget here, Wes, because I forgot yesterday after the long break, my brain was elsewhere. But select Cousin Subs locations are now offering delivery. Whether you're ordering catering or your favorite sub, they're delivering right to you when you order online at cousinsubs.com. Cousin Subs, we believe in better. All right, well, you mentioned one of the Packers on the defensive side of the ball that I'd like to talk about a little bit here, and that's defensive tackle Kenny Clark. He's in his 4th season. The statistics so far through 10 games don't really match up as far as the tackles, the sacks, that kind of thing, don't really match up to where he was last year. But we started to see in that Carolina game before the bye, it almost felt like the, I hate to say old because Kenny Clark's not that old,
but slightly younger.
But it's sort of like the old Kenny Clark started to come back. And I've been wondering, I'll be honest with you, Wes, I've been wondering much of the season. Kenny Clark is not a guy who's going to talk about it, but he was on the injury report earlier this year with a calf injury. We saw in the one game he got kicked in the shin.
Right.
That can't feel too good. I think he's been playing through some things and at the same time having to deal with how offenses are paying a lot more attention to him in terms of their scheme and how they want to handle him in the middle of the defensive line. But his play really stood out against Carolina, and I'm wondering, okay, maybe is Kenny Clark's season about to take off here?
Yeah, and it was interesting, hearing some of the comments from Jerry Montgomery last week, because in some ways I think there's, in talking to Tyler Lancaster about this Monday, I think there's narrative that Kenny Clark in some ways has dropped off. I don't see that. I think, one, as Montgomery pointed out, he wouldn't go into the exact specifics, but he said, he's getting double-teamed a lot more in the running game, which is what you expect. He's the premier nose tackle. That's what's going to happen. So there hasn't been as many of those one-on-one situations. The Packers, again, are playing him a lot, 83% of the defensive snaps to this point in the season. But that game against Carolina tried to block him one-on-one a lot more than a lot of other teams did. And I would imagine going into this game against San Francisco, you're going to see that second guy having more attention on him because whether it was their center or Trey Turner, they just weren't able to match up with him, and he was able to be disruptive. He came a little bit short of being able to get an actual sack on the stat sheet, but Pro Football Focus had him down for 10 pressures, which under their metric and their measurements, that's the most he's ever had in his career to this point.
And that's a lot for an interior pass rusher.
It's a huge amount.
A guy who really never lines up on the edge at all. He's always inside.
Yeah, and I made this argument in my story too. The other thing you got to understand, in terms of just the pass rush, he has 2 outside linebackers now that are really shifting the hourglass from last season. There are not as many opportunities for a 315-pound defensive tackle to be the first guy to the quarterback. Those guys are in that O-zone. They are making things difficult, and it's getting the ball out quick. With the big thing, I think, for Clark here down the stretch is going to be if they can, one, find ways to give him some breathers here and there, because that's going to be important if they want to play an 18 or 19 game season. And also, figuring out a good balance for when you want to have him out there early on downs or when you want to have him on third downs. I think the last few games you started to see them find a little bit more of, a balance with all that. Maybe that's because Montravius Adams is back and he seems to have put the shoulder behind him. Kingsley Kuechly is playing more. The more Kenny Clark is 24 years old, you want to be able to get him out there as much as possible, but I think there is sometimes that, you want to strike something there where you're getting the maximum out of that player every single down, and I think that's one area that maybe at this point in the season, as you get into the month of November and December, late in the year, where you're starting to maybe figure out what that right number is going to be.
Yeah, and we'll see as we go into this San Francisco game here if they do resume the double teaming in the middle on Clark, especially with how they're going to want to run the ball. The bottom line is whether it's Montravius Adams, Kingsley Kuechly, Dean Lowry, Tyler Lancaster, if those guys are one-on-one against the run, they've got to be able to get off the block and stay in their gap, or keep Blake Martinez and B.J. Goodson, Oren Burks, whoever is at the second level, keep those guys clean to be able to make the play. Because if you're getting double teamed, then you're helping out a teammate, and then that teammate has to take advantage of that situation.
Yeah, and to his credit, to Clark's credit at this point of the year, now 10 pressures are going to up his total pressures for the season. So he's at 41. I mean, that puts him in the same conversation with Aaron Donald, Fletcher Cox. I mean, those are the high-end, elite defensive tackles in this league.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's been kind of this narrative that maybe he's had something to do with the run defense and the issues they've had there. But, man, I mean, one, that's an entire unit. That's not just one specific player. But, two,
Right.
look at what he did when Christian McCaffrey was running in his area and his gaps in that game against Carolina. It's tough to point out stats other than the screenplay that he broke up when he came off his block and ended up chasing him down. It was difficult. It's been tough sledding still for them to get through that area. And a lot of times when it has been, it's been the double team. So it's going to be really intriguing to watch to see where the rest of his season goes. But at 24 years old and the snaps that he's had and the way he's played, I just think there's a certain amount of respect you got to put on Kenny Clark's name right now, despite some of the issues the defense has had.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. One other item to clean up, I guess we could say, or a leftover item from the bye week, and that is that the nominees league-wide, every team in the league nominates a player for the annual sportsmanship award. And for the second year in a row here in Green Bay, that nomination has gone to Tramon Williams. Interesting in a lot of ways that he takes a three-year break from playing in Green Bay and then comes back, and now these last 2 years he's been the sportsmanship award nominee. Something that he certainly appreciates. I know he's one of your favorite players to talk to. He's certainly one of my favorite players over the years to talk to, and you can't say enough about just how well he represents himself and his team and his defense and his teammates anytime that he is on the field, and that's what this award is all about.
Yeah, the media award will come later in the season, and certainly he's always in the running for that as well. But, I mean, in my time on the beat, he's one of the guys that I think I've learned the most about the game of football. Listen to him talk, and when he's as thoughtful as they get in terms of hearing a question and giving an appropriate response and not just trying to find some quick soundbite to just move on with his day.
Yeah.
He takes the time. And it's also important that that's something that has been reflected in the locker room with his players, the guys around him. He even mentioned this was unrelated to the sportsmanship nominee, but he was asked from ESPN's Rob Domofsky about Marquez Valdes-Scantling. If you can help him out, give him some encouragement as Valdes-Scantling's kind of working through some stuff right now, injuries-wise and production-wise. And he goes on to mention, one, yes, he can. Two, he happens to be Valdes-Scantling's neighbor. And three, he mentioned how the reason he thinks guys like that will succeed is the same reason why Jair Alexander has succeeded in this league, because when there is an issue and something does happen, those guys go out of their way to ask Tramon questions, how he worked through certain things in his career. What did he do when he felt this way? Because everybody in some regard, even though the positions are different, go through a lot of the same emotions throughout the course of a long career. And Tramon's a guy that has been a resource for players along the way. He joked that, this must mean I'm just a nice guy. But he also mentioned last year when he went and looked at the nominees for all the teams, the class and character that he was put up with, that meant a great deal to him.
Yeah.
And being able to have his peers feel that he's on that level. He did joke that when he saw that Drew Brees won it and the other guys who were finalists, he's like, yeah, I don't know how I could compare to them. But it is something that I think you saw Julius Peppers when he was here receive it, that nomination. It goes a long way, and I think it just speaks to the type of player that Tramon's been in this place for over 10 years now, and the kind of teammate that he's always been.
Yeah, ultimately with this sportsmanship award, there are 32 nominees, one from every NFL team. Eventually that gets whittled down to 8 finalists, 4 from the AFC and 4 from the NFC. And then is it in that, like, the Super Bowl show, or
it's in that whole honors
the
thing.
whole NFL honors the night before the Super Bowl is when the league-wide winner is announced. I think it's pretty cool, though. I will say this, and this has nothing to do with sportsmanship per se, but the fact that Tramon Williams got his first interception of the season against Carolina, and it's his first interception since he came back to the Packers. Last year was it remains the only season in his 14-year career that he does not have at least one interception. So he got one in 2019. I know he's looking for more, but when you look at the year-by-year stats, when you call it up on a computer screen and you look at the interception column and you go down and there's a number in every single column for every single year except for last year. That kind of impact, that kind of longevity, that's really impressive in this league.
And it speaks volumes about Tramon too. That the reason, mean, he played half the season at cornerback, so I can't, just say he didn't have his opportunities. But he ended up shifting to safety, a position that he hadn't really played down after down ever in his NFL career, because that's where the defense was, and that's the role they needed him to fill, and he did it. So Tramon Williams is a great one. And when this thing's all said and done, and I know he probably wants to play till he's 50, but he's going to be a guy that I think, in terms of media types, and I'm sure the players that are on this roster now that have been affected by him, he's an all-timer. I mean, he's one of a kind, and he's a guy that he came in as an undrafted free agent, and every time you talk with him, it's still like you're talking to an undrafted rookie that's just not, I don't want to say happy to be there, but definitely a down-to-earth perspective that you don't always get with a guy that's been around the league this long.
Yeah, he's appreciated every opportunity that he's gotten in this league, both in Green Bay, then when he went to Cleveland and Arizona, now that he's back in Green Bay. There's an appreciation level that you hear in his voice almost any time you talk to him.
In a fun story, I'll close on this. Rob Domofsky, again from ESPN.com, my former colleague, he was asking him a separate question about, Kyle Shanahan's coming in. Kyle Shanahan was the offensive coordinator for a time, one season with the Cleveland Browns. He asked Tramon, hey, have you ever, did you work with him at all? Was he still there when you signed with Cleveland after becoming a free agent a number of years ago? He said no, but I'm an old guy, right? Kyle Shanahan was the receivers coach in Houston when Tramon signed as an undrafted free agent back in 2006. I mean, just the longevity you talk about for him. I joked about it on Twitter, the 6 degrees of Tramon Williams. It's like every coach and player has some type of Tramon Williams moment
connected to him somewhere along the line. He started as an undrafted rookie with Houston, and then in the middle of his rookie season, I believe it was November of 2006, the Packers, Ted Thompson signed him to the practice squad in Green Bay, and then from basically getting into the lineup in 2007 through 2014, he was a fixture here with the Packers, and now he's back.
In a career that someday will have him in the Packers Hall of Fame, and his hope to have another Super Bowl ring.
Yeah. All right. With that, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Packers Unscripted. Be sure to follow all of our coverage of the team on Packers.com. You can subscribe to us, like us on iTunes and other podcast services. On Twitter, he's at Wes Hod. I'm at Mike Spofford at Packers for the team account. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Oh yeah. Young Moolah, baby.